So guys, here we are, and what we are going to do today is, as it says on the title of this video, we are going to predict the future of the current Formula 1 grid between the start of 2023 until the end of 2029. Again, I am not going to, as it says in the description of this video, I am not going to go through every single driver on the grid. It's going to be most of the grid that I go through, and also a driver that will be on the grid next season, I will mention as to his future in Formula 1. So that's what we're going to be getting into in today's video. And of course, we will start at the very front of the field and start with the man who is about to win his second Drivers' World Championship. And that is, of course, Max Verstappen. Now, given how this new set of regulations, this new era of 2022 has begun, with Red Bull and Ferrari clearly having the two best cars, and Red Bull being the best team in Formula 1, because not only do they have a car quick enough to win a championship, but obviously operationally they are much better than Ferrari. Red Bull will be the team to beat between now and the start of 2026. So Max Verstappen, in my view, will have, by the end of 2025, probably two more championships, which will make him a four-time world champion by the end of 2025. Of course, he's going to win the championship this year. By the time this video has been released, this is being recorded before the Singapore Grand Prix, but by the time this has been released, he has, I'm guessing, won his second world championship. So, yep, he'll be a four-time world champion at the end of 2025. After 2026, though, it is going to get a little bit more difficult for Max Verstappen. The reason is because Red Bull, at the moment, don't actually absolutely know what their plan is engine-wise from 2026 on. Will they partner back up with Honda? Will they build their own power units? Will they maybe do a deal with Porsche? We don't know yet. Or actually not Porsche, maybe Audi, we don't know. We don't know what their official plan is when it comes to the 2026 regs and what power units they're going to have. And I think that will cause them to be not as dominant and not as great after 2026. And I think we'll see certain other team, Mercedes, bounce back in 2026 with those new regs, because we know with new engine regs, Mercedes do tend to do pretty well, as we know from the past. And I think Mercedes, even in this current era, will bounce back. So after 2026, things will get more difficult, but I do think he'll win another world championship between 2026 and the end of the decade. Of course, his contract at Red Bull ends at the end of 2028, which is pretty much at the end of this decade. So Max Verstappen, in my view, will be the best driver in this decade and clearly the driver to beat. As I'll get into in a few moments' time, Lewis Hamilton, even though he is still right on at least Max Verstappen's level right now, still for me, Lewis Hamilton is the absolute best driver on the grid. Max is going to be, for the future, the one to beat. There is no doubt about that. And again, for the next 2 or 3 years, definitely Red Bull are going to be very hard to stop. And there's only one team that can stop them, which is Mercedes-Benz. But let me get into this graphic, which displays how I think, or what position Verstappen will be in at the end of the 2020s decade. So, in 2029, he will be a 5-time Drivers' World Champion, in my view. He will stay at Red Bull for the entire decade. Even when he gets to 2028, I think he'll probably just sign a new contract. I don't see Max Verstappen driving for another team, to be honest. The only other team I can see him joining is Mercedes at the end of his contract, again, in 2028. And by the end of this decade, he will have 75 to 80 race wins. That's an approximate. I'm not going to sit here and try and predict an exact number, because that would be crazy to do, but I think he'll have around 75 to 80 race wins. At the moment, has about 31, and again, I'm recording this before the Singapore Grand Prix, and will have about 35 to 40 pole positions by the end of this decade as well. And what this will mean, if he does end the decade in this position, he will be able then to go into the 2030s, and in 2030, I think he'll be... How old will he be? 32, 33, something like that. So he'll probably have, if he still wants to keep going to break, Lewis Hamilton's records, he would probably have a good, 5-6 years left, with Verstappen at least. He will then be in a very good place to then become, statistically, the greatest driver of all time. Of course, that is a long way away, Max Verstappen getting into that position, but he will definitely be, by the end of this decade, already one of the greatest drivers of all time. Not the greatest, but in that top 4 or 5 drivers. There is no doubt about it. To be honest, at the end of this year, you could argue Verstappen is already in the top at least 15 best of all time, arguably top 10 greatest drivers of all time, given that we know he is going to go on and win more world titles. So Max Verstappen, again, is the man to beat, and that's how I think he will do for the rest of this decade. But what about his teammate, Sergio Perez? Well, for Sergio Perez, we know at Red Bull that he is in a similar position to Valtteri Bottas when he was at Mercedes, or Rubens Barrichello when he was at Ferrari, or even you could say David Coulthard when he was at McLaren and teammates with Mika Hakkinen. He is the loyal number 2 driver, basically, of the Red Bull team, and is, very consistent for Red Bull, very dependable for the Red Bull team. And I don't see, as long as Red Bull keep winning titles, which they will, at least for the next 3 to 4 years, I don't see Sergio Perez going anywhere. And my prediction for Perez is that he will keep racing for Red Bull until the end of 2026, or at least around that time. And then he will leave and probably finish his career at a smaller team, say a Williams or a Haas F1, maybe an Alfa Romeo that will become Sauber by that point. We'll see. But that's how I think Sergio's rest of his career will go. And at Red Bull for the next few years, he will probably collect 3 or 4 more race wins, a load more podiums, and go down as a very liked and great member of this team. No doubt about that. But now, let's get into the current Ferrari drivers and how I think the future of their careers will go. So we'll go on to Charles Leclerc, who we know currently is in a position of where at Ferrari, he's doing a great job in terms of his own driving, but the team, as they've done to Sebastian Vettel in the past, Fernando Alonso in the past, arguably you could say Kimi Raikkonen after Raikkonen's first world title win in his first stint at Ferrari. No matter how well those drivers, including Leclerc, have done at the Ferrari team, Leclerc just cannot overcome the amount of mistakes, the costly mistakes that Ferrari are making, which is ruining any chances that Charles Leclerc can have of winning a world championship. And as I have talked about in a previous video, which should be linked below in the description, Charles Leclerc is never going to win a championship at Ferrari. He needs to leave Ferrari if he is going to win a world title. And his contract, we know, ends at the end of 2024. And I think by then, Ferrari will, keep making these silly mistakes we've seen. They'll keep costing him race wins and good results. And if the Ferrari car is still as quick as it has been this season, they'll probably still keep costing him chances at winning a maiden world title. And by the end of 2024, I think Leclerc will be pretty much sick of being at this team and having so many chances thrown away by his team and being handicapped by his own team. And this is what I think will happen for Leclerc for the rest of the decade once he does leave Ferrari. So I think he will join the Mercedes team for 2025. As I'll get into in a moment with Lewis Hamilton, I think Lewis Hamilton will be leaving the Mercedes team and retiring before Charles Leclerc's contract does come to an end at Ferrari. And like I said, I think he'll join Mercedes in 2025 to partner George Russell. And then in 2026, I think Charles Leclerc will win his first driver's title. Even if he doesn't win it in that year, though, I think Leclerc will win. If he does join Mercedes, I think he will win a driver's title with them. And I do think Mercedes, for sure, will return to being a front-running, title-contending team. Just not as strong as they were between 2014 and 2021. I don't think Mercedes will ever be as strong as they were during that time period ever again. I don't think that's going to happen. But like I said, I think he'll join Mercedes in 2025 and then win his first driver's title the year after. And then by the end of the decade, I think he'll have about 25 race wins and end up with about 40 to 45 pole positions in total by the end of the decade. I think Leclerc at the moment has 5 race wins, again, before the Singapore Grand Prix. So another 20 wins between now and the end of the decade, I think seems pretty realistic in predicting that. And if he wants to win a world championship, Leclerc, that career path of joining Mercedes when his contract ends, if of course there is a seat available, that is the path he needs to take. Because if he does not join Mercedes, obviously he's not going to go to Red Bull because that is Max's team, he will not win a world title. It's not going to happen. Ferrari are not going to win a world championship in this decade. It's not going to happen. They will have chances to win championships. I don't think they're going to be like a midfield team or anything like that. They'll probably have another 3 or 4 chances to win a championship, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, Ferrari are not going to be winning world titles, which is why Leclerc will have to leave Ferrari to win at least one world title in his career. What about his teammate, though, Carlos Sainz? Well, Carlos, at Ferrari right now, not being treated as a number 2 driver, but let's be honest, he is number 2 to Leclerc in terms of talent and skill and just raw pace at Ferrari currently. And I reckon as well he will, because he's now contracted to the Ferrari team until the end of 2024, I believe by then he'll be fed up of the Ferrari team as well, because I don't see Ferrari going really forward massively between now and when his contract ends at the end of 2024. And I don't think Sainz will be really that keen by that point to continue being second fiddle to Charles Leclerc. So I think Carlos Sainz will, after collecting probably another 3 or 4 race wins, I reckon he'll get in his career. Obviously, he's only won 1 race to date, again, before the Singapore Grand Prix, at the British Grand Prix, as you can see on your screen at the minute. But I do think he will collect probably another 3, 4, maybe 5 at most race wins, probably another couple pole positions and a load more podiums. But I think he will want to be more so the number 1, kind of like Daniel Ricciardo wanted to be when he left Red Bull at the end of 2018 and joined Renault, wanted to be more so the main focus at that team. That's what I think Carlos Sainz will want when, leaving Ferrari at the end of 2024. And this is how I think the rest of his career will go after that point. So, he will not feature in a World Drivers' Championship battle in this decade. I do need to make sure to point that out. And the reason is because, as I got into in a previous video, which you can check out on the channel, and it's a video about why Carlos Sainz just isn't an elite F1 driver, I don't see Carlos Sainz, unless he's the number 1 driver in a car that is the best on the grid, I don't see how Carlos Sainz wins a world championship or can consistently compete with the top drivers throughout the season. We've seen this season. He just cannot consistently fight with those drivers in every Grand Prix, or in 95% of Grand Prix, and I think he will end up just not being good enough to be in a world title fight for the rest of the decade, no matter what car really he is in, unless, like I said, he's in the best car on the grid and happens to be the best driver in that particular team. And like I said a few moments ago, he'll leave Ferrari when his contract ends, and I believe he will join Aston Martin for 2025, replacing Fernando Alonso, who I'll get into later, who I think at the end of 2024, which is when his contract, I think, is until. I know Alonso does have the option for a third year, which would take him into 2025, but I think Alonso will actually retire from Formula One at the end of 2024, and that will lead to them replacing Alonso with Carlos Sainz. Aston Martin, though, I do believe will start to progressively, now that they've got some people acquired, obviously, from the Red Bull team and some other top teams as well, Aston Martin will start to get better, and I reckon by the end of this decade, Aston Martin will be at least a front-running team and will be a contender to a certain extent. So that's why I think Carlos Sainz will move from Ferrari to Aston Martin, and I think he'll do pretty well at Aston Martin and have a decent career with them. So that's what I see for Carlos Sainz going forward for the rest of the decade. Now, let's get on to the Mercedes drivers, and we'll start with Lewis Hamilton. And I'm going to keep it pretty simple when it comes to Lewis Hamilton. I think he will retire at the end of next season. Not because he's, demotivated or just isn't good enough anymore. Obviously, he is easily good enough and is still, for me, the best driver on the grid. If only he had a car that could properly compete with the other top drivers in Formula 1 right now, such as Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc, who are in much faster cars on a consistent basis. But what I think will happen next year is Mercedes will bounce back and be title contenders next year, and Lewis Hamilton will get his revenge for 2021 and win an 8th World Championship, and then I think retire from the sport, because I think Lewis is the type of driver to retire on top, and I think that would be actually the best way for him to retire from Formula 1, to retire on top and go out absolutely, without a doubt, statistically or opinion-wise, as the greatest driver of all time. We'll get into how I think here with this graphic, just how I think it'll play out. So yeah, he'll win his 8th world title in 2023, then retire from F1, will go down as the GOAT statistically, and I think will retire with around 115 race wins and around 110 pole positions and 8 world titles. And yeah, as well, not only do I think he's the type of driver or type of person to retire on top, but also, if he was next year to win his 8th World Championship, why, in my view, why would you continue at that point? Because, I mean, he's, 37? 38 almost? I'm not sure of his exact age, but he is nearly 40 years old. And if he was to win his 8th world title next year, there's not anything else to accomplish. I mean, yeah, you could build some ground on the people behind you in the record books to make sure that your records last even longer. But, if you win that 8th world title, if you're Lewis Hamilton, I just don't see what else there would be to accomplish. And I think he would have pretty much, as a driver, completed Formula 1. So that's why I think he will retire at the end of 2023 with his 8th world title. And I have to just say, before anyone says anything, that I don't want him to retire at the end of 2023. I want him to keep going for years. I know he has said that he wants to keep going for years, but if he was to win an 8th World Championship next season, I think his opinions on that might change. But yeah, I don't hope that he retires next year. I don't hope that at all. I want him to be on the grid for as long as he wants, because Lewis Hamilton being on a Formula 1 grid would be absolutely fantastic for Formula 1 and for the entertainment of Formula 1 going forward as well. But that's what I think is going to happen. We'll see if I am correct or not. But what about his teammate at the time, George Russell? Well, in with Lewis Hamilton retiring, in my view, and winning that 8th world title at the end of 2023, Russell, from that point on, going into 2024 and beyond, will now be the clear number one at Mercedes. Well, not the clear number one, but he will be I guess you could say, the team leader, even though I do think Charles Leclerc will join Mercedes in 2025. I still think Russell will be the team leader, even though Russell and Leclerc in 2025 will be of equal standing within the team in terms of driver status. There's obviously not going to be a number one, number two driver type status within that team. Kind of like at the minute with Hamilton and Russell, like, you know, they both have equal status, but Lewis Hamilton is the team leader because he's been there longer out of the two drivers. I think that's how it will work with those two. And in regards quickly to who will replace Lewis Hamilton for 2024, I think that will be, again, a temporary replacement, because I don't think that Toto Wolff will want to or will be able to find an instant replacement that is anywhere near the quality of Lewis Hamilton. I think it'll probably be Nick de Vries for a year replacing Lewis Hamilton, and then once Leclerc's contract comes to an end, or Lando Norris's contract comes to an end, which I know is in, I think, end of 2025, then I think that's when they would go for those type of drivers who would be able to get a lot closer to what they would have lost with Lewis Hamilton. Again, though, that is if Hamilton does retire at the end of 2023, like I think he will. But going forward after 2023, I think George Russell will be Max Verstappen's main challenger or contender for the rest of the decade. In my view, let's say Lewis Hamilton is not on the grid, I think Russell, I don't think he's the best driver on the grid if on the Formula One grid if there's no Lewis Hamilton. I still think it would be Max Verstappen, but I think he would be, out of, say, himself, Leclerc, Norris, Sainz, you know, whatever drivers behind, Piastri, I think George Russell is the best driver out of those group in terms of his, you know, talent, skill, and pace. I think he's the best driver that can challenge Max. Obviously, it does depend on whether the car is good enough, but I think he will be Max's main challenger for 2024, 2025, and then I think Mercedes will properly bounce back with the 2026 regs, which, to be honest, I think they'll probably start focusing on pretty soon, given that the current power units in terms of their development have been frozen. So give some time to focus a bit on 2026, as those regs will fly around quite soon enough. But let me get into this graphic just showing how I think Russell and, you know, the rest of the decade will go for him. So I think he will win 2 drivers' titles in both 2027 and 2029, respectively. Again, with the new 2026 regs, I think Mercedes will more so bounce back then. Like I said, with Lewis Hamilton, I think they will bounce back next year in being, you know, title contenders and front-running race-winning contenders on a consistent basis again. But I think they'll be more stronger after 2026 than they are going to be in this current era before we get to those new regs in 2026. So I think he'll win 2 drivers' titles and have 2 titles by the end of this decade. And like it says there, I think he'll be Max Verstappen's main challenger from 2024 onwards. And I think he'll also remain at Mercedes for the rest of the decade and end up with 35 to 40 wins by the end of the decade as well. Obviously, at the moment, doesn't have any race wins. But yeah, by the end of this decade, I think he'll have quite a lot of wins. And to be honest, I think Russell will probably end his career as the second, third best British driver of all time. Obviously, Lewis Hamilton is probably always going to be the best British driver of all time. I don't think there's going to be many contenders ever for that status, but I think Russell could definitely go down as the second or third greatest British driver of all time. The talent, skill, pace, all of it is absolutely there for Russell, and if the car is at a world title contending level, which I think it will be from next year on, really for the rest of the decade, with Mercedes getting stronger again from 2026 on, then look out for George Russell, because I definitely think he will be a world champion. He has, I think, everything you need to be a world champion. Just doesn't have, at the moment, the car in 2022. And also, his teammate is the greatest driver of all time, which is pretty hard competition. Lewis Hamilton hasn't exactly got worse, has he, in 2022. So, yeah, look out for Russell in the next few years. But those are the top drivers from the top teams. Let's now get into some of the midfield teams and the drivers currently occupying those seats. We'll start with Lando Norris. I did say in an earlier video, I think the video I did about Lando Norris having the career that many don't think he'll have, that I think he'll have, if that makes any sense. I'll post the video in the description of this video, don't worry about that. But I kind of already alluded to the future of Lando Norris, at least for the next decade. I think he will stay at McLaren until the end of the decade. The reason is because by 2025, when his contract comes to an end, I don't think there'll be anywhere for him to go unless a new team, a new top team, suddenly appears that isn't Mercedes, Ferrari, or Red Bull, which I don't think is massively likely, to be honest. And I think he'll stay at McLaren, probably sign another 3 to 4 year contract, and then be with them at least until the end of the decade. And what he will basically be is a driver that wins maybe a race or two, collects a load more podiums, but ultimately just doesn't feature consistently at the front of Formula One races. Not because he's not good enough. He's definitely good enough. He's already proven that. But because the McLaren team, in my view, will not be a proper front-running, title-contending team in this decade. I just don't see it happening. Now, I know I could be wrong because McLaren, they're building, I think, a new wind tunnel and they are investing more in, some very important resources. I get that. And they definitely should improve on where they are now. But at the moment, we're seeing that they're already underperforming, given what resources they have currently. This year has been a bit of a disappointment, really, for McLaren because they haven't really took that step forward that they really should have from last year, where I think last year was about the peak of what they could have done in that last little era of F1. But yeah, I just don't think McLaren will ever be, in this decade, a front-running, title-contending team. So that's what I think will happen with Lando Norris. It's a shame, but if he can find another team that can win championships that isn't Mercedes, Ferrari, or Red Bull, then I think he's definitely got a good chance in the future. But what about his teammate for next year, Oscar Piastri? Oscar Piastri, obviously, he's joining McLaren for next year, and his contract is until the end of 2024. What I think will happen firstly with McLaren is, I think the first season at McLaren next year, I think he'll do a decent job. He won't be as good as Norris next year because Norris is already comfortable on that team. It'll be Piastri's obviously debut year, and Piastri, I don't think, except for the simulator, has really driven these cars. So yeah, it's going to be a tough year next year, but I reckon by 2024, I think we'll see him pretty much on similar pace to Lando Norris, because I think Piastri is very, very talented. And what I think will happen with Oscar Piastri is, I think he will, with McLaren, I think he will, sorry, my stream at the minute that I'm recording this video on is messing up quite a bit. Sorry about that. Piastri for McLaren, what I think will happen is he will be kind of like with Carlos Sainz in 2020. I think Piastri will be pretty much on the same pace as Norris. Maybe not as good as Sainz was in that year in 2020 with McLaren. Obviously 2019 as well compared to Norris. But I think Oscar will be at a point by the end of 2024 where he will need to really join another team to to really progress, because like I said, I don't think McLaren are really going to be going forward in the next few years. And I think if he really wants Piastri to become a front-running driver and compete for race wins and podiums and that lot, I think he'll have to leave McLaren. And that's what I think he'll do. I think at the end of 2024, after a good couple years at McLaren, I think he will leave them. And because, like I said earlier, I think Leclerc and Sainz will leave Ferrari, I think Oscar Piastri will join Ferrari. And I think he'll race for them and be their probably number one driver for 2025 onwards. That's what I think he'll be, or where he'll be going from that point onwards. And I think he'll then become a front-running driver. He'll be competing for wins, podiums, maybe in a certain couple years, he'll be competing for world championships, but because it's Ferrari, he won't win a world championship no matter how well he does. So that's what I think will happen with Oscar Piastri in terms of his next few years. And to be honest, as a career path, that would be a pretty good one, going from McLaren to Ferrari. And yeah, that's how I think it will go. Him getting to a point with McLaren where he's pretty much on equal pace of Norris, and maybe not as good as Norris, but very, very close to him. And I think we'll then want to break away and go to another team where he can be the number one driver. And if Ferrari were to lose Leclerc and Sainz at the end of 2024, then I think going to Ferrari would be probably the best option, quite clearly, for him. But let's get into the man he's replacing at McLaren for what do you call it, for 2023, Daniel Ricardo. Now, in me trying to come up with my predictions for the drivers, it was very hard to determine what I thought was going to happen with Ricardo. He's not going to be on the grid next year. I don't believe that is going to happen at all, unless it's been announced that he's going to be joining the Haas team or the Williams team or something like that. Again, obviously recording this before the Singapore Grand Prix. I think Ricardo will probably be off the grid in 2023. And to be honest, I don't think we're going to see Ricardo again after this year in Formula 1. I think he'll probably go to IndyCar. The only chance I see is in 2024, him joining, say, the Haas team. Maybe the Sauber team, but that does depend probably on where Valtteri Bottas is at that time, and whether Valtteri Bottas wants to stay with what would then become, Alfa Romeo to Sauber for 2024. Yeah, we'd have to see what would happen in regards to that. But unfortunately, and it is very unfortunate to say this, I don't think Daniel Ricciardo will be on the grid after this season, because his performances in the last few months just have not been anywhere near good enough. And given some of the young talent out there and how good the grid is now, I just don't think there'll be really any places for him to fill. Again, the only places on the grid I can think of is maybe a Haas or a Sauber. Other than that, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe you could say Williams, but I think that would really depend on if Williams were properly a midfield team, not, touring around at the back of the field. But yeah, I think Ricardo, after this year, sadly, is done in Formula 1. Now let's get on to Fernando Alonso. And yeah, pretty simple for Alonso. Obviously, he's joining Aston Martin for next year. What I think will happen is Aston Martin will get better next year, slightly, and then probably the year after. They'll start making steps up. There is no doubt about it. Aston Martin will start to improve. But because Fernando Alonso is impatient, and I don't think he'll want to wait around for 4 or 5 years for Aston Martin to become a front-running title-contending team, I think Fernando Alonso will retire at the end of 2024. And like I said earlier, I think his replacement at Aston Martin will be Carlos Sainz, who will be with Aston Martin probably for the rest of the 2020s decade. If he's going to stay on the grid past 2024, really, Fernando does need for... let's go back to that clip again of Fernando. Yeah, Fernando really does need Aston Martin's progress to be a bit quicker than even they expect, because if they let's say Aston Martin, because obviously currently they're quite far down in the Constructors' Championship. If by the end of 2024 they're in a position where Alpine are now, which is fourth in the championship, I just don't see how Alonso would want to, keep waiting around and stick around, hoping that they become a front-running team. So they're going to have to make a bit more progress and start really, to bridge that gap between themselves and the front-running teams. But, that's just what I think is going to happen. I don't think he'll want to wait around forever. But we'll go on to his teammate quickly, Esteban Ocon. For Esteban, I think he will remain at Alpine for the rest of this decade. And I know that's quite ambitious to say, him remaining at Alpine for another, 6-7 years. But I don't see where he could go, really. I mean, if Lewis Hamilton does leave Mercedes at the end of 2023, maybe he could replace him for a year or two. But I just, other than that, I don't see where he could go. And Alpine, I think, definitely until the next set of regulations in 2026, I think Alpine will be pretty much where they are now, which is an upper midfield team. So I don't think there'll be really any massive reason for Esteban to leave. Obviously, it's a French team, so they want a French driver in their car, and he is one of the most premier French drivers out there. And I think Ocon, probably for the rest of the decade, if he does stay at Alpine like I think he will, he'll grab probably a couple podiums, maybe more than that, maybe a few podiums, more so than a couple, maybe get another surprise race win, but I think Esteban Ocon will be stuck in the midfield from now on. And I think joining him at Alpine for next year and staying with him for quite a while will be this man, Pierre Gasly. I think he will join Alpine for next season, and I think Gasly will be an Alpine driver for at least 3, maybe 4 years, because again, French driver, French team, and as long as he performs well in Alpine or an upper midfield team, I don't see why Gasly would be in a desperate hurry to leave and go elsewhere unless Mercedes, Ferrari, or Red Bull had an opening. So I think Gasly will probably stay at Alpine until 2026 or 2027, and then move maybe to another midfield team, upper midfield team in F1. Maybe you never know. In the future, could go to McLaren, especially if Piastri does leave at the end of 2024. You never know, that could happen. But I think Gasly will be in the midfield, just like I said with Esteban Ocon. I just don't think those two are going to really go anywhere higher up the grid. But let's get into a couple final drivers in this, predicting the future of Formula One. And the penultimate driver we'll get into is quickly Valtteri Bottas. Valtteri Bottas, I think, will remain at what is currently Alfa Romeo, soon to be Sauber. And I think, I've written down that I think he'll retire at the end of 2027. It will at least be around that time, 2025 to 2027. Where he'll be, I'm not sure how old he'll be, but he'll be in his late 30s, I think, by that point, Valtteri. The reason I think he'll still be at that team is because he's still a good driver, consistent driver, still, when the car's good, pretty quick in qualifying. And with Audi probably coming on board in 2026, I think he'll probably want to stay around for that. So that's why I think he'll retire at the end of 2027. And I do think he will be joined by Théo Pourchaire at the Sauber team for 2024 onwards, replacing Zhou Guanyu, who I think just sadly won't do well enough to continue on the Formula One grid. But Valtteri Bottas, I think, will just stay in the midfield now, and he'll retire, like I said, in a few years' time. Finally, though, I just want to quickly go on to Mick Schumacher, because in regards to Ferrari, like I said earlier, I think it'll be Leclerc and Sainz leaving the Ferrari team. I just said a few moments ago that I think Oscar Piastri will replace one of them and be the number one on the team. And I think the number 2 or the other driver in that team will be Mick Schumacher. The reason is because Mick, I think, is I think he is a good driver. I think he is good enough for F1. I think he just needs more time, really, does Mick, in Formula One. And I think he will eventually get to a point, say in 2024, where he is proving that he is definitely good enough for a move up the field. And I think from a PR standpoint and a money-making standpoint, I do think Ferrari are pretty desperate to get him in their car because obviously it is Michael Schumacher's son. So I think it will be Oscar Piastri and Mick Schumacher racing for the Ferrari team from 2025 on. After that, who knows who drives for Ferrari, but to be honest, I haven't given who's going to be driving for the Ferrari team as much thought as to, say, the Red Bull and Mercedes teams, and the reason being is because no matter who drives for Ferrari, they're not going to win a championship because the problems at Ferrari are deeper than just the drivers. They've had so many great drivers in the last few years, but as a team, they've just ruined their chances consistently. I guess I haven't really talked about who replaces Sergio Perez at Red Bull at the end of 2026. The reason I didn't talk about this was mainly because I think it will be someone who's not on the grid yet, or probably not even in F3 or F2 yet. Because obviously, the end of 2026, when he's, that's what I said would be the time when he would leave the Red Bull team. That is still quite a way away, that time. So, yeah, I think it'll probably be whoever replaces him. I think he'll be someone who is not currently, obviously, on the Formula 1 grid, but probably not on the F2, F3, or maybe even F4 grid, to be honest. But whoever that replacement is, it will definitely be a bit worse than Max Verstappen. It's not going to be a driver that can, regularly compete with Max Verstappen and challenge him, because I don't see why Red Bull would go for a equal status between the two drivers at Red Bull as long as Max Verstappen is at that team. But guys, let me know in the comments section of this video, what do you think of my predictions? And let me know your predictions for the drivers that I went through. The drivers I went through was what? Verstappen, Perez, Leclerc, Sainz, Hamilton, Russell, Norris, Piastri, Ricardo, Alonso, Ocon, Gasly, Bottas, and Mick Schumacher, I think it was, that I all went through. Let me know in the comments section what you thought of my predictions for all of those drivers. And let me know what your thoughts are for those drivers and the teams as well going into the next few years in Formula 1. But guys, until my next video has been me, Chazza HD. Goodbye.